So somewhere around the time I was born, my parents became really convicted that they shouldn't watch R-rated movies. And that was passed off to their kids. So growing up, we were largely a G and PG family. You get to, two or three of those upper level cuss words, the ones, then the show was turned off. I even remember a common refrain when watching TV with my family, where my mom would say, "Close your eyes," in order to save us from women in bras. Funny enough, however, I watched the first three R-rated movies in my life at school. We watched The Pianist in World History, R for Holocaust violence, Rain Man in psychology, R for several F words and I believe a sex scene, and The King's Speech in Speech and Debate, R for several F words being actually a part of the central plot. And yeah, obviously, I went to public school. So today's guest is someone I've known for a couple years now, having once or twice maybe been on his podcast, The Overthinkers, and I've followed his work for some time. I knew him even before he got to be a big fancy film critic. I'm really excited today to talk a little bit about movies and film with Joseph Holmes and really diving into a Christian approach to movies. Welcome to Theology Meets Word, hosted by me, Jake Doberenz. This podcast delves into the heart of real-life issues with theologians, ministers, activists, and writers who share their unique stories and insights. Keep up with the show at jakedoberenz.com/TMW and subscribe to updates and weekly funny newsletters at jakedoberenz.substack.com. Don't forget to rate and review the show and share it with your friends and your enemies. Now, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Joseph, thanks for being on the show. We've flopped roles, I think.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's really cool to be on your show. You've told I do the podcast host thing, but on that, you do a lot of the question asking, and it's really about the guest being able to, draw out the guest. And now I get the one where my expertise is being called upon. So I very much enjoy that.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry I didn't introduce you like you introduce guests on your show with all kinds of superlatives and hyperbole and always a hoot.
It's so funny. Well, on my podcast, I always make a routine to have people's names, whatever their first letter of their name is, to have an adjective that fits that. J is one that's kind of hard to do, though. There's only like 3 or 4 that are complimentary. So I know that mine is a struggle.
Absolutely. And also, Joseph, once upon a time, helped come up with the name for the show on Twitter. So you also have him to blame for Theology Meets Word, which is great.
Please. It was a stroke of genius.
Yes, a stroke of genius.
You were the person who, was posted on Twitter and said, "Hey, anybody out there, got an idea?" And I just, helping out a friend, put the first thing that came to mind. So you clearly have excellent judgment for picking.
Yes.
Seeing how this was the perfect title for your podcast, which I'm very excited to listen to when it comes out.
Absolutely, yeah. And, we're waiving your customary guest fee because you came up with the title or something like that. I don't know. We'll make it work.
We will.
Absolutely. So let's jump in. So you were born to 2 ordained ministers, and they encourage you to think deeply about theology and movies. And they gave you the opportunity once to even have your thoughts put in your dad's sermons. So tell us about that experience growing up in such a household.
Yeah, that's really funny. I bring this up when I talk about my history just because it's so, you hear that and you're like, oh, okay, well, that explains everything about Joseph Holmes that you need to know. But yes, my parents got together because they both went to seminary. They were both ordained in New York City, where I now live. Another piece that explains so much about me. And one of the things you have to understand when you have 2 parents who get together because they're in the same kind of like academic program is they're both going to be massive nerds. And of course, if they are massive nerds, in this case, if it's about theology, what that means is you're going to have a lot of dinner table conversations built around applying whatever to their shared love, which in this case is theology. But they also love movies, and we love sharing movies as a family. So many of my favorite childhood memories involve sitting around the dinner table and them riffing on conversations about that we just watched and how it applies or doesn't apply to theology. One of my favorite and more consistent memories is how we would watch Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which is one of those like littler known Disney films starring Angela Lansbury as a witch who fights the Nazis, which, again, one of my favorite movies as a kid. And, my parents would do this really interesting thing. Again, like we would watch that together and they would be like, okay, so, Disney is doing this thing. It's got a witch in it, but that's not what witches are actually like. But here's some like things about it that are actually applicable to, Christian theology or boys. And they would do these kind of riffs like that. And I remember one time, again, when your parents do something and you're participating in it, one of the things you always want to do is you want to, particularly if you have a good relationship with your parents, you want to jump into it and participate in it. And so I remember doing that where I would say, hey, the part, she animates these knights, these suits of armor in order to fight the Nazis. And I was like, so then once her magic, her attention goes away, they all collapse. Their life goes away, even though they had like life and personalities. I said, that's like how the Bible says that God's spirit animates us. Jesus, all things cohere in Christ. If God removes his spirit from us, we go away as well. I said, that's, really cool thing connecting movies to theology. And you said, not realizing how audacious this was, say to my dad, hey, you should talk about that in a sermon sometime when you're trying to, as a sermon illustration. Because Dad used sermon illustrations all the time. And I was just really excited that I thought my idea and my connection was so brilliant. He really should do it in his sermon. My mom and dad, did not, to their credit, tell me how audacious that was and presumptuous that was to tell my dad what he should put in his sermon. Instead, I found later on, my dad actually did put that in one of his sermons when he was explaining that. And that, of course, started me on the path to assuming that my ideas are super brilliant and everybody should listen to them. Hence why I have a podcast and my job is being literally a film and book critic where I get paid to tell other people what they should think about movies and books and culture.
Yes, absolutely. You are very brilliant, and it is good to hear your voice.
Stop.
Although I admit I don't agree with all of your takes all the time. But that's okay. I still want to hear what you have to say, and I still appreciate that.
No, as you should. You should disagree with some of my takes because some of my takes are wrong.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Excellent. Yeah, and I still relate to a lot of that experience. My parents were not ordained ministers or as theological, but movies being something that really brought us together, and that was something that was integral in my family. And interestingly, I became the theology guy. My brother became the film guy. He went and got some film degrees and, is trying to break into screenwriting and that kind of thing. That's how that works, apparently. So excellent.
Your childhood does affect you. Like what your parents help form you to love is a huge part of what you end up loving as well. And of course, the ways that they help you hate intentionally or unintentionally affect what you run away from or what you end up fighting. I was reading a book. I'm sorry, this is not on topic, but very briefly, there is a book called Handing Down the Faith, which basically goes through all the studies of what's parenting techniques and what parenting things that this you can see I talk for a living, what cause kids to actually stay in their faith going on. They do Christians and Muslims and etc. And one of the big things they said, which was talking about your faith with your kids at least once a week, increases the chances they will stay in the faith rapidly, which of course my first thought with hearing that was, wait, doesn't everybody do that? But apparently not. So anyway, go ahead.
They don't, and that's fair. They really don't. Yes, that is extremely important. And yeah, no, that was really relevant. I'm glad you brought that up. That's always good to remember. Well, Joseph, you are somebody that wears a lot of hats. But I think one of your fanciest hats that you wear is this hat of film and book critic. Typically you'll look at movies and things from kind of a religious angle. You've been published in places like the New York Times, Christianity Today, Forbes, Religion Unplugged. Those little rinky-dinky little publications that nobody knows about. So I'm genuinely not trying to be mean here, but I want your take on this. Why critique movies? Like, what value are you offering the world by writing on film, culture, books, religion, etc.?
Yes, I have somehow fooled people into thinking it's a good idea to pay me to do stuff that I would be doing for free. I mean, again, I would be just what I do is I just talk with my friends about movies and stuff all the time, which is I'm very, very blessed. I remember I was complaining because I was assigned to write a review about a TV show that I hadn't seen, and I was like, I'm not interested in watching this show. And somebody said, you are being paid to write about watching a TV show, so don't complain. I was like, that's a good point. So what value do I add so I can keep up the charade to people? But no, as value do I add? Because I do think I add value. It's the fact that it's this: if something matters, it's worth engaging with deeply, and we clearly all, whether or not we admit it, we all believe that movies and TV matter because we spend so much time and money on it. I forget what the exact rates are. I think Statistia I was looking up says that around 3 hours a day people spend watching TV. And of course, that's the hours that they're not working, presumably. So that's a good amount of, on average, free time that we're in front of TV screens. And that's not counting like going out to movies or something like that. So we clearly believe with our bodies that this matters, even if we say with our mouth doesn't. So again, if something matters, it's worth engaging with deeply. And of course, engaging with something deeply means engaging with it with our hearts as well, but also our minds. Again, if any time somebody loves, somebody romantically, they want to write poems and sonnets about them and to describe in detail why they're beautiful. And they do this in the Bible, in the Psalms. Again, one of the big things that opened up for me was when a pastor explained, how do you worship God? Well, let's look at the Psalms. You describe all of its positive attributes. But then also, if you love someone or something, you want to talk about the things that are wrong with it or them so that they can improve and get better. And you have to do that specifically or in detail, or it doesn't work. You do that with your friendships. You do that with, someone's piece of writing. If you're getting feedback, if you love someone or love something, you want it to be the best version of itself, which means critiquing it in some way. Then you have, the me aspect. Okay, so why does somebody get paid to do that? Why is it valuable to have outsource that to somebody like a film critic? The reason is because it takes time to actually spend the time thinking about and digesting and understanding movies and why does this affect us emotionally and what's good about affecting an emotion. Because this is the other thing. Again, it's not just, we love this and so we want to describe what's good about it or we want to get better. Movies and TV and all these things, anything that you spend a lot of time on does affect you for good or ill. James K.A. Smith has talked about this in detail as a Christian philosopher. He's talked about desiring the kingdom, imagining the kingdom. And he's done a lot of work showing and talking about how what you spend time on does shape your heart for what you love and what you believe even, because your beliefs often are, in the back of what you love. Your loves drag your beliefs in many respects. So, okay, if that's the case, it's really important for us to engage with not just in a passively accepting manner, but in a critical manner, in a way that we can understand you and push back. Again, if you're spending time with a friend and that friend is both a good and bad influence, you want to be critical about how you're being influenced, embracing the good as well as the bad. So why do people outsource it to people like me and not just do it for themselves? Well, the reason is because it takes time to actually think deeply and on movies. You spend time thinking about that. You're not doing other things. Again, doctors have to spend most of their time thinking about how to best not let people die. And I want them to spend most of their time, their deep intellectual time focusing on that and not on the finer points of composition in Lawrence of Arabia. So that means we outsource it to people, like me or others, Roger Ebert, Tyler Smith, who can say, Tyler Smith is a Christian film critic, less famous than Roger Ebert, but he should be just as famous. Anyway, regardless, so that you can actually have help from somebody else who says, here is a deeper way to think about this, to prompt you and make it easier for you to think deeply about this too. So one of the things I look for as a Christian film critic is I try to read things or watch things and use my experience and think about these things to help people think more deeply about what they're watching so that they can think more deeply about what they're watching too when they watch it. Or I can say, actually, maybe this is something you shouldn't watch or isn't worth your time because it's not going to benefit you. Or maybe this is something that is worth your time and is going to benefit you, particularly, again, in the faith-based space. Christian films have a bad reputation among many, certainly non-Christians, but many Christians as well. And so I like to be the person who says, hey, this one is actually good and you should watch that because you might not know about it if I wasn't in there watching all of the movies for you in that way. And then very briefly, and we'll get to this more, but you asked about kind of doing this in the religious faith-based space. One of the things is that we have a lot of ideas and things that we care about that are not always very integrated with each other. Like, how does my faith apply to this? Or how does thinking about this from a Christian perspective apply to this? We're not always very educated in how to integrate those things. We're much better with this about politics, sadly to say, because we have, 5 days a week, 7 days a week, you can watch a podcast that will explain to you how, you can watch Ben Shapiro 5 days a week, and he will explain to you how your politics should integrate with the Barbie film. But we don't have complete, worldview, because it applies to it maps out all the intersections, what you should think about every particular issue. So if you ask, again, let's take it from the other side. You can have a feminist can explain to you how to watch the TV show Friends from a feminist worldview, and how it integrates with your feminist politics. And I know because I read them explaining it to me all the time. And so, but if as Christians, we believe our primary identity and our primary worldview should come from our faith, we should have an equally, if not more so, robust way of understanding whatever we're watching within that context. So that is my extremely long answer to that. Very good question.
Thank you for, defending your profession and livelihood for us. Congratulations, you still have a job. You've justified yourself. Yeah. No, excellent. I think that's an incredibly good point. We need to, our faith matters more than just on a Sunday morning, maybe a Wednesday night if we're like extra good Christians, it matters throughout the week. And to your point, my goodness, media is so influential. We consume it. Everybody does. And it's important to talk about that. And we'll go to a little bit more later about maybe some of the ways that kind of forms us. But maybe we could just kind of start off broad here, though. Is there a Christian, in air quotes, Christian way to watch movies? Does our faith have anything to do with, what we queue up on Netflix or what movie we go to see at the theater?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm very happy that you ask such great questions. It means that it's you're in the right, you're doing the right thing by having a podcast. So yes, I would say that there is a Christian way to do it, although I think it's very valid for different Christians to disagree on some of the nuances of it. Again, I love, Tyler Smith and Kevin McCreary and all different, Alyssa Wilkinson and all these different Christian film critics, and I will often disagree with their takes. But again, we all fall under the banner of Christian. Jesus and the first apostles were very clear that being a Christian does change how you see and therefore interact with the world. In Jesus' time, children were not primarily seen, particularly in Rome, as intrinsically valuable. They were considered conditionally valuable, as in they can carry on your family name, they can do honor, they take care of you when you're old, etc., etc. But they weren't intrinsically valuable, which is why so often Roman parents would leave their kids on the side of the road to die. When Jesus came along, he very explicitly, and the Christians, they very explicitly said, no, children are valuable intrinsically, which is why Christians would go around picking up, adopting children who are left on the side of the road. So, and you can see this also kind of with how Jesus treated women. It's like, oh, women are and men are different, therefore women are untrustworthy and their voice shouldn't be taken seriously. And Jesus didn't do that. The early Christians didn't do that, which, so all of that is true. So our worldview, our Christianity should affect how we approach things in the world, obviously. Now, the thing is, we do have a problem, which is that movies weren't around when Christianity was first starting. And so we as Christians have to put some of the work in ourselves of saying, okay, what do things that Jesus taught us about how to see the world differently, how do those things apply to this new technology? Now, people have talked certain analogies about like Colosseums. Like they did talk about entertainment. How does entertainment, we look at it as Christians? We do have some church fathers who engaged with some of that. But, one of the things so there are different things that I try to do when talking about movies. Like, what are movies? What do movies do? The movie technology does a couple of things very explicitly. One is a machine that expresses and inspires love and worldview. That is two things that it does by its nature. You can't get around that. Why? Because it is a camera. It is montage. A camera, by definition, points your attention at one thing to the exclusion of other things. That is an expression of value. This thing matters. This doesn't matter as much. Again, the focal point. This is in the foreground. This is in the background. The music. This is what you're going to feel about this thing. Anytime you're talking about what things matter more than other things, you're making expression of value. You're also inspiring love and attention. Lady Bird does this whole thing where it's just like, what is love other than paying attention? I think that's an overstatement, but certainly it's a big part of it. What you're watching is telling you something worth loving. But also montage is that's a technical term for the editing process of like, okay, we have this image. Now we're going to cut it together with another image and create a connection between those two. The famous one is Hitchcock, who would say, here's a man smiling. Okay, now let's put next to it a piece of food. Okay, he's hungry. Oh, there's, a woman in a bikini. Oh, the dirty old man. So it's like those two connections create relations between things. Christians believe that at the center of the human being and the human being life is to love and be loved. Firstly, it's to love God and then love others. The Westminster Confession is, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And every version of Christianity has some version of that because it's part of the great commandment. The first great commandment, love Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So because movies make value judgments of what things are worth loving more than others, because worship is really just what you love most, whatever you love most. Because movies make value judgments of what you should love most, it's not a value neutral thing. It also, because it makes connections between things, it's not worldview neutral. So Christians then need to engage with movies, either be excited by, inspired by, and also be critical of what it places its attention on and focuses on love. And so that's the starting point of like, okay, does this movie, does this show, does it connect things that should be connected, or that we agree that should be connected? And then we can be critical about it, engage with it, and say, I'm not sure about that. Or does it make connections between things that are true and beautiful, and we can be inspired by them? And so that's a kind of a critical analysis of it. Or can it challenge us and say, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way? Or can it just give us enjoyment about being reminded, like, oh, wow, and nurture us in something that's good? But there's also, and for that, we have to then just get into details of what does Christianity teach about those things. But then also on a very specific level, if we are meant to love God and love others, does this movie, not just what it's saying within the context of the movie, but how we're relating to this movie itself, cause us to love God or love others more? Again, be more human. And one of the things I look at is, are you engaging with movies in such a way that it brings you closer to other people or further away? So again, I watch movies, like one of my best things I love best, I watch movies and then I talk about them with other people. That is movies creating in me a deeper connection with other people. But if you're watching movies and it's causing you to be a substitute for human interaction, then it's like, okay, this is a problem because it's pulling you away from the cheap end of man, which is, to love God and love others. So that's the very basic above ground idea of when I'm engaging with something from a Christian worldview, as there is a Christian way. There's details you can get specific about it, but then you have to actually put the work in to understand how Christianity intersects with movies as a medium and technology and how you're using it.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for kind of the overview of all those things. Obviously, this is not a simple topic that we can solve in one podcast episode.
Darn it.
Yeah, as you mentioned, like, we got to kind of work out what are the teachings of Jesus before we kind of get into how does that apply to movies, and people kind of disagree on that, strangely enough.
No, what?
I know, it's crazy.
I've been on Twitter and I see only uniformity between Christian voices.
Absolutely. So for kind of the next part here, maybe we can get a little more in the practical world, and maybe you could use some examples if any come to mind. But I kind of want to share first sort of an experience I had as a kid, and I mentioned this a little bit at the top, where I was in a pretty conservative kind of evangelical adjacent space, and we really assumed people took on the qualities of entertainment they engaged in. If you played violent video games, you would be a school shooter or something, or you watched movies with sex scenes and boobies, and then you'd be indiscriminately promiscuous or something. And in my family, we couldn't watch Harry Potter because my family was afraid that the witchcraft would, change me, and then I would get into witchcraft and I would sacrifice the family cat or something like that. I don't know. And so I'm really wondering, you've talked a little bit about how do movies change and affect us, but maybe more specifically, what do we do if kind of maybe the package is bad, but there are elements in the story that are really good? What do we do with, nowadays, especially like, your Netflix original shows or whatever, they can be gruesome and, they got all the swear words and the nudity and all kinds of stuff. Do we just kind of wade through the bad, or do we avoid it? Well, probably multiple parents use this, but another example is my dad used to say, like, if there's just a little poop in the cookie, you don't eat the cookie, right? A little bit of bad stuff, we throw it out. So can you help us kind of maybe deal with the little bit of bad stuff part as that relates to how it kind of forms us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, you're in the right business of podcasting with all these questions. And yeah, this is a very common issue in Christian household because, again, Christians rightly take this seriously. That, we understand, because we have churches, like, we understand how practices and beliefs and kind of the process of worshiping shapes us. And we understand intuitively that movies do this. But of course, Christians are not the only people to do this. Again, I have all the people I know who make fun of Christians for, being upset by, boobies and swear words, and are also saying, hey, see how this camera angle is from the man's perspective? That is objectifying women. It's like, oh, look at how all the people, all the criminals are black. That is perpetuating racism. It's like, so everybody believes that it affects you. Now, the question, of course, is how much and what should you do with that? And the short answer is more than some people think and not as much as other people think. That's the short answer, not very specific. So I will get specific here a little bit. People, to your point about the video games, politicians and people have been trying for so long to be able to blame school shootings and such on video games. And believe me, we can safely say that if there was a very direct causal connection, we would have found it by now, because so many people have been trying very hard to find it. And the best that they've been able to do with like video games and like violence in TV and stuff like that, best that I've been able to find is very small children, it makes more aggressive. Like violent movies make more aggressive. Very small children, it does. But totality-wise, it's such a minor factor in a sea of other factors that is really not worth the amount of time that we spend talking about it. We do know that porn affects people, and there is a lot more evidence that porn affects people, and there's certainly a lot of movies that cross the line into porn, would say. So, I think my rule of thumb is go where the evidence leads. It's really nice to have theories about how something is going to affect somebody, how much and what kind of things are worse than others, et cetera, et cetera. But I like to see some evidence, and a lot more evidence that portrayals of explicit sex harmful to people than I do portrayals of explicit violence. So I'm a bit more concerned about the former than the latter because of the evidence that I've seen. But when you're talking about kind of how much something affects you, one of my rules of thumb is the kind of 5-friend idea and percentage rather than absolutes. So, people say this thing like, your personality is the sum total of the last 5 people you spent time with. People, I mentioned earlier, if you're watching, let's say, if you're listening to, let's say, the Call Me Daddy podcast 5 times a week and going to church or engaging in Bible study twice a week, which thing do you think is going to affect you more? And so if you're watching movies that in some way have content in there, and I will get into, particularly if you're interested, way content, because there's a difference between something being portrayed as something being glorified, and that's something people don't often have a distinction between, but we can talk about that later. But let's talk just percentages right now. If you're spending more time with something, because I said movies are a love creation machine in a sense. Roger Ebert says it's an empathy creation machine. I kind of disagree. I think it's a love creation machine. If it's a love creation machine and you're spending a lot more time on something that influences you to love, let's say something in a horror film or something in a romance film more than you are something to inspire what God says you should love, that's a problem. So at the very least, what you should look at is what percentage of time am I spending on one thing versus another? And within the movie itself, what percentage of this is something that's a bad versus not? Again, there's the poop analogy, which is an analogy. But again, analogies don't prove, they only explain. There's another analogy that Jesus used, which is, and he's Jesus, which is the wheat and the tares, which is that you really can't get away from sin at any kind of sin being in anything. You have to create fairly arbitrary lines. If you were to get rid of any piece of art that had sin in it, you would have no art. But then, okay, so we don't have art. Well, if you were going to get rid of any influence in your life that had some kind of sin, including other people, you would not, you would get rid of all the people. So I don't think that analogy is as good, but I do think we should be thinking critically about these things, which is very convenient for me to say because then people can look to me and outsource to me. I should think critically about these things, but it is what I sincerely believe.
And I sincerely believe that as well. I think that's an excellent point, and I do hope people read your stuff and things like that to start thinking critically about that. As you mentioned,
that's why you don't have to pay me this.
Oh yeah. Oh no. I mean, yeah. There's a good point that you spend some more time doing this than other people. So yeah. You also have a unique perspective that on film, and I mentioned earlier my brother being a screenwriter. He has different perspectives and things. He went to film school and he knows stuff that I didn't see that. But yeah, to your point, like I think it's a good one because it's important to understand, like you said, that some things affect us, maybe not as much. I've used the example before, and I'll see what you think about this. Like for me, like cussing is not a temptation for me. I have a very clean mouth. I don't say the bad words. I probably, there are some words that I consider bad that like 95% of people don't consider bad. And so to hear stuff like that, that's never seemed to really affect me or bother me. And I don't know, maybe there's an element of just sometimes people are different too. We have to think of the human factor here, that people are affected by different things and stuff. There are some general rules, but also people are a little different, and we should kind of know ourselves and think about ourselves in all of this. But anyway, we came on to talk for you to talk, not for me to talk.
No, I like hearing what you have to say. That's a really excellent point. And sometimes this can be a cop-out. Sometimes people use the idea of, well, it affects individuals differently, as a cop-out, just so that they can, they can do something even if you don't want to do it and don't feel judged. But it also happens to be true that we can make general principles but then apply them individually as well. And there has to be room for that. So you're absolutely right. That's a great, excellent point.
Yes, and I am a huge advocate also that we don't go around the world or faith as individuals. We also have communities. And so there's also a role to say in our communities for somebody to take us aside and say, no, that's affecting you. You're a little more violent. You're more aggressive. You're more objectifying of women. You're a little more racist or whatever it is. Like there's also that piece. And we have to also have the humility to accept, oh, I thought it wasn't affecting me, but it did.
Well, and that's an excellent point as well. Again, one thing that, because I'm a public intellectual, can talk about things from like a universal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need to understand that as Christians, we are specific local communities. And so a big job is for us to be like, okay, I can see how this is affecting you. And you as an individual, and we as a community can do that, who knows each other actually personally. Like you said, as individuals, we have to stop leaving places where people do that so that they can actually hold us accountable. So, very good point.
So maybe real briefly, before we wrap up, you could just kind of, is there any other kind of guidelines or something you might give people? I know a lot of people might be looking for rules, and I don't think you're the guy that's going to lay out, here's the rules, or once you reach 2 F words, turn it off, or whatever, but is there any other kind of guidelines you can kind of help us with as people are wrestling with this in their own context?
Yes, I actually will do this. I have one that I've talked about, and this is the difference between glorifying versus portraying. And I know that, because I know people really do want specific guidance, even if it's not rules, but guidance. And I think that that's important. People should have some of that. What my rule of thumb for if something is portraying versus glorifying is, where is the catharsis? And the example I typically have is in horror films. There are a lot of Christians who are just like, don't watch any horror films. I don't subscribe to that. But I do understand the concern, and it's a great example. So let me talk about catharsis for a little bit, to understand this narratively and psychologically using very, ordinary words. But catharsis is what happens when you get emotional satisfaction after conflict is over, or after anticipation and tension is over. So it's the relief you feel at the end of a rom-com when the people get together. It's the relief you have at the end of a Marvel movie when the heroes win. Whatever it is, whatever tension has been building up, and then there's satisfaction. And that actually shapes what we love, because we remember, oh, that made me feel so good. I have that again. So when I always look is, okay, what tension is the movie or work of art creating? And where does it create catharsis? Because wherever it's doing that, that's essentially what it's glorifying. That's what narratively is creating a savior for us, saving us from that tension. So in horror films, there are 2 kinds of horror films. There are horror films that are about where the tension is in the monster, so to speak, and the catharsis is in the escaping from or beating the monster. In that, it creates catharsis in us. It creates a love for overcoming evil in a way. But there are also, that's like, It Follows does this, or It's Chapter 1 and 2, or whatever, the Conjuring movies. They all do that. There are also other kinds of horror movies where I would place in the other end, where the tension is, and is the monster going to kill the people? But the catharsis is when the monster succeeds. That I would place, I'm going to call them out. I've called them out before. I'll call them out again. Friday the 13th movies do this. The Saw movies do this. A recent movie I just watched, which has been getting a lot of praise, the movie Longlegs does this. So there are movies where the catharsis is in, and Longlegs is particularly bad because it actually does portray evil as all powerful and says that about the world, which is not true. But this is not just be applied to horror movies. Rom-coms do this. Again, if it's portraying a toxic relationship, but it inspires you to want them to succeed, that's something that's creating catharsis for something bad. Heist movies, like The Italian Job and even Ocean's 11 to some degree, do that. It's like certain horror films, like call it A Silence of the Lambs, are interesting because it does both. It creates catharsis for when Clarence, whatever her name is, lead hero, catches a serial killer, but also when Hannibal Lecter comes on top of his enemies. Those both create catharsis. In fact, him getting one over on her is how she gets the information she needs in order to stop the serial killer. So movies can be complex about this, and it's worth engaging with and saying, I don't think, for me, Silence of the Lambs is not a movie that I watch all the time. I don't make a rule about watch against it. But those are the kind of things that I want Christians to start saying, if I am going to say this is not something to watch, or this is something to watch, then I'm going to use those kind of things. But I will also say this, like as a film critic, it's my job to kind of go into the war zone and kind of look at these things for you. And I also say for a lot of Christians, again, I point out, some Christians are doctors and pastors and social workers, and they don't have the time to be going through all of these movies and saying, okay, which one should I watch? Some of them just need a shorthand, which is, I'm not going to see R-rated movies, I'm not going to see horror movies, whatever. And that's fine. My only objection is that the only thing in many Christian cultures we have is shorthand, and we should have like levels of, okay, this is shorthand that's helpful, and this is, if I want to go deeper and more detail, how to do it. But that's my big kind of piece of advice for people who want something concrete.
See, I really just had you on selfishly so that I could, know. But no, it's excellent. This is good stuff here. This is helpful, practical. That's what we're trying to do here today. And you talking about that catharsis resonates with me. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad you pointed out the idea of glorifying versus portraying evil, because my goodness, especially my Christian brothers and sisters, just get it wrong. Like, yeah, they just don't understand how that works or how stories work or narratives, anything.
One of my favorite things, this doesn't actually come from a Christian one, but it's like somebody was saying the movie Beauty and the Beast is problematic because Gaston is a sexist. I was like, yes, and he's the bad guy. That's the point.
Yeah, yes, that is a good example of people that don't know how to watch movies. And anyway, yeah, excellent stuff. Well, I think it would actually be sinful, Joseph, if I didn't squeeze this last question in. Well, the last question before the final question we ask everybody. But I just want to know, like, hey, real easy question. What's the best Christian movie of all time? Defining Christian however you want. What's the best one?
So, okay, this is famously a question that annoys like every film person. Like, what's your favorite movie? It's also like really annoys, Christian film critics. Like, what's the best faith-based movie? Partly because like, well, how do you define this? So actually, funny enough, I have a definition of faith-based film that I put on Religion Unplugged website. And basically what I say is it's any movie that affirms a real world faith, an essential part of the film. And I keep that broad very specifically so that can include, it can include things like Calvary, also include a Sherwood Pictures, movie Facing the Giants. But then also, it doesn't have to be the script or story where it's primarily doing that. It can be the images where it primarily does that. Again, it's about, as a primary part of it, it affirms a real world faith. So that's how I define it. I think that's the best way to define it based on all the factors that make it useful. Go look up that article, Defining Faith-Based Film at Religion Unplugged, Joseph Holmes, to see if you agree.
I'll put in the show notes, Okay.
Perfect. No, so to answer your question, so the reason this question annoys me, partly, is because I really want somebody to make a movie that makes Passion of the Christ not the correct answer to this. I will say this, I will give another answer just to give people something else to look at. But I say this, Passion of the Christ, it does one of the best jobs of fusing and integrating Christian faith and belief and worship of God into the film format. Again, just into the sinews of film form. I will give an example of the central, probably one of the main central tenets of Christianity, is the fact that Jesus conquered sin and death through submitting to death and abuse. And so, okay, if you want to get across Christian theology through film, that Christian theological point through film, how do you do that? How do you get across that idea? one of the best Christian scenes, maybe film scenes I've ever seen, is Jesus on the ground, beaten and bloody, and his mother is there, and he turns to her and says, "See, I make all things new." That idea of being beaten and bloody is the moment of triumph, practically, is a central part of Christianity. And they get that across on film. Even just the ideas of Mel Gibson using a cameo of himself to nail Jesus in, to say, as a way of saying, I also theologically, I participate in Jesus's death as well. Again, to use a cameo to make a theological point is amazing. So I would say, if you want to actually have one of the best unions between worship, religious worship, and a movie, look at Passion of Christ through those eyes. But I will give another answer, because that's the answer everybody gives. I'll be very quick about it. I actually say the movie Signs by M. Night Shyamalan, because that is, again, and that kind of inspires a lot of when I try to make movies or write movies or talk movies in terms of faith. Because again, that movie, first of all, the story is about a preacher who lost his faith and gets it back. So right up front. But it also uses the film form in terms of editing to make connections, faith connections through it. Because again, at the beginning, you have all these scenes. He actually says explicitly, faith means looking at the same thing in different ways. And he shows you a bunch of scenes of the bad things that have happened to him in his life. And then at the end, because he's in different contexts, he actually sees all those things in different ways to show how God has worked through them for himself. It's for his good and his family's good. And that process of actually seeing the world differently through faith, again, is done with film editing, very specifically. So that's kind of, those two movies are kind of what I look at in terms of what I'm saying, what is a movie that does best job of portraying faith, or at least my experience of faith through the film medium, better than I've seen other places.
Wow, excellent. That was a great answer. However, the correct one was Prince of Egypt. That was actually the correct answer.
Okay, that's also a great one. Again, there are actually really good ones.
Great visuals, music. So anyway, but yeah, that was good too.
There ones actually, again, I have a Letterboxd account we can link to. I do have the best 25 faith Christian films of all time on there, something like that. And I'm still moving it up and down. But I was like, man, there are actually good ones in here. So, if you know what they are, you can find them. They do exist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we ask everybody at the end of Theology Meets World this same question here, and I'm curious to see what you have to say. So before we end, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do right now to live their faith fully for Jesus. What challenge do you offer our listeners to put into practice this week?
That is a really great question, which I am not prepared for. Okay, I will say this. And this is really going to feel lazy to do, but I will say this. Go to church 3 times a month or more. I say this because the data is extremely clear. Particularly, I will say this, if you're a man, even if you do not feel like it, and Nancy Pearcey has done some great work on this, and so has Brad Wilcox, but that men who go to church 3 times a month or more are the least toxic, the least abusive, the most loving. And Christian men who go to church less than 3 times a month are the worst. I say this again, I'm focused on men because I'm a man, and that's, but the data that says that people who go to church 3 times a month or more, who are generous, more loving, is extremely robust, and also have the least amount of depression and anxiety. Actually, people who went to church 3 times a month or more were the only group during COVID that mental health actually went up rather than down. I'll repeat that. Didn't go down slower, went up rather than down. But it'd be 3 times a month or more. And so I would say that if you want to improve morally, just increasing level of gratitude, also different things. Because this goes to a part of what you spend the most time on is what affects you most. And so I frequently do not want to get up and go to church. Again, I'm a guy. Guys do not like church as much as girls do, just statistically. You can ask why, but that's the truth. I don't like it, but I do it anyway at least 3 times a month because I know data-wise how much it improves my moral character, how good it is for my mental health. So that would be something very practical I would suggest.
Beautiful. Sounded like you prepared to me, so that was good stuff. Yeah, you pulled out the statistics out of your back pocket. Always good. Spoken like a writer, somebody who does his research. Excellent. Joseph, it's been a pleasure, and I'm sure people want to know more about you, and you write all over the place. So where's kind of the best way to find some of your writing? Where would you point people to?
You can definitely go to josephholmesstudios.com. That's where I have a bunch of links to right on the homepage. You scroll down to all the different places that I've written. That's the easiest place to go to. Obviously, if you want to go to, Christianity Today or to Religion Unplugged, where I have my most frequent stuff, that's there. Also, the Overthinkers podcast. We have
Absolutely.
Once a week, we talk about, faith, art, culture, all of philosophy, all the things we're interested in. We try to do what I talked about today, which is integrate our faith into everything. And again, not every episode ends with "here, come to Jesus," but just all the aspects of our life, all things we love, which includes a huge part of it is our faith, want to integrate together and how to think deeply and engage deeply with all those things. So definitely would love for you to check that out as well. We also have a Facebook group for the Overthinkers. So if you want to go to Facebook and just talk about all of this kind of stuff, you can find it there as well. So yeah, and I'm on the socials. I'm on the Twitters and the Instagrams and the Threads. So you can just search my name.
Excellent. We'll do that. Yeah, that's a good Facebook group. The Overthinkers Facebook group is a very interesting place of nerds and just kind of people who overthink. What do you know?
Lots of intellectual memes too.
A lot. That's true. A lot of good memes. And you and Nathan do a good job of kind of, the phrase that came to mind was like poking the bear, putting something provocative in there, kind of stir some things up. So
yes. Yeah. Nathan Clarks is my co-host on the Overthinkers, and he is very smart and very funny. And so I'm very, very blessed to have him co-curating the page and the podcast with me.
100%. Well, thanks so much for being on Theology Meets World. We super appreciate you being our guest expert today. You provided us a lot of things to think about and ponder, and some movies to watch as well. So your homework today is to go to church, but the other homework is to watch some of these good films that he mentioned.
You know what I love to do? Go to church with friends, go out to see a movie afterwards. It's Beautiful. One of the best Sundays I have.
Beautiful. That's a great Sunday idea. I love it. So anyway, everybody, thank you much, and we'll catch you next time.